Friends, if you are joining in on our Zoom call or over there on Facebook Live, it is with great pleasure that I introduce our guest teacher for today. His name is Kevin Miller. He is an award-winning filmmaker and author. If you've followed me at all, you probably have seen me reference a couple of different movies. One called Hellbound. That's one that I heavily relied on for a few years there, and still frequently point to people to. And his latest in full feature documentary work is called JESUSA. Is that the correct way to?
That is correct, yeah.
Awesome. And it kind of is a look at the relationship between American nationalism and Christianity, and sometimes the violence that erupts from that relationship. And so Kevin's going to today talk to us a little bit about having contentious conversations, which it seems like all of us, I don't know, I've never been in one, but I've heard that they happen. So, but Kevin's going to talk to us a little bit about how we approach those conversations and how they can actually be productive rather than destructive. So, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to go ahead and mute myself.
Okay, well, great to be here. And I feel like I have to point out ahead of time that I'm coming to you live from my youngest daughter's bedroom. This is not my office. It's just the only room in the house that has a door. My office is open to the rest of the house, so you'd be hearing budgies and disagreements over all kinds of things. So anyway, it's good to be here. I want to give just a brief preamble to just why I'm talking about these issues. But yeah, I'm a filmmaker and an author, and I've been working on films, documentaries primarily since I think I got started around 1993. And oftentimes working on the documentaries that I work on, I kind of joke that I make books that make kids smile and films that make adults angry. But what I try and do in the films that I work on is basically try to facilitate or start conversations about issues that tend to push a lot of buttons. I tend to come into these things kind of excited about what I'm learning, and I want to share it with other people, but very quickly you find out that things can get very political right away, and things can get really personal as well. And so more and more it seems that it's very hard to just have a civil disagreement with somebody. We see this in politics, we see this in theological issues, where we can't just have a difference of opinion. We start to think that the people who disagree with us, they fall into some possibly nefarious categories. And so what starts out as a clash of ideas very quickly becomes intensely personal. And so I want to talk a little bit about maybe how we can work around that. And I want to kind of as a grounding text, looking at Romans, the beginning of Romans 12, where I'll just quote it for you here from the NIV. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. For just as each of you has one body and with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. So I think a few key things I want to pull out of this. Number one is, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world. Well, the first question is, what is the pattern of this world? And I'm a big fan of someone named Brené Girard, who would argue that our default pattern as individuals is to externalize blame and to externalize responsibility. When we run into situations like the one we're in right now with the pandemic, what I'm witnessing on social media is scapegoat. This is a very unsettling situation that is really compounding itself in terms of not only the disease, but then our responses to it, our changing responses to it, our critiques of those responses. And it seems like everybody's running around trying to find somebody to blame. So I think that is really the pattern of this world, is to find a scapegoat. And what we tend to do is we find community around our enemies. And I think that is exactly what the enemies of Christ did, was they found, Caiaphas, he makes that point when the Sanhedrin meets, when they're trying to decide what to do about Jesus. Better one man dies than we all perish. So they find unity amongst themselves. They find unity with the Roman authorities around this scapegoating of Jesus, because he's a big threat to the status quo. And so we don't want to conform to this pattern. We're having discussions. We don't want to point to scapegoats. We want to be renewed. We want to change the way that we're thinking. And the other thing is, we don't want to be thinking more highly of ourselves than we ought to. That we should always think of ourselves as sober judgment. And finally, we don't want to try and negate people, because we're all part of one body. Paul is speaking about the church, but I think this is humanity. I think this extends beyond humanity, that we all are we're all interdependent. And so it doesn't make sense to try and negate. I always say that I tend to learn the most from the people I disagree with the most, because I'm forced to really re-examine what I'm thinking in light of their critique, even though it might make me angry to hear that critique. Once I kind of get over that and start to really sort of analyze it and try and make a response, it forces me to examine myself and also to humble myself, because the best that any of us can offer is just one perspective on truth. So it's very important that we approach issues as a body, and so that we have a set of checks and balances. Somebody said to me on Facebook today, I thought it was really wise. He says, actually I'll quote it for you here so I don't get him wrong. And this is, by the way, comes from a guy that I disagree with a lot. But he said, when people distrust authority, including science, they are left to opinions. These social media platforms allow opinions the same weight as carefully reasoned and tested scientific work, but they're not equal. And but we can kind of fall under the illusion that they are equal. So, all right. So we definitely don't want to be conformed to the scapegoating mentality. We don't want to think of ourselves more highly than we ought, and we don't want to try and negate other people. So how do we avoid doing that? Well, I want to walk you through a little thing here. I'm going to, I'm not checking my email here. I'm trying to share my screen. Just one second. And so Cody, I'll get you to let me know when it's working. So let me know when you all can see that.
It's good. It's good.
Okay. All right. So, thing here. All right. So this is a little infographic I made to try and help you understand how we have conversations. So we see in this picture, we have two people. They're both happy. They both are reading the Bible and getting something out of it. And I think that a lot of us sort of think when we're studying something like the Bible, this is what it looks like, is that there's us and there's the Bible. So what we're getting is just basically the unfiltered truth. And I know that I've definitely run into this when I work on films that deal with theology, is I'll get people quoting scripture at me as if I've never read it before. And as if I just read that particular verse or passage, that will automatically change my way of thinking. And it doesn't seem to occur to them that I've formed my view based on reading perhaps that exact text. It's just the fact that I interpret it differently. So this is kind of a naive way of looking at the world. And so when we have a disagreement, this makes the agreement very personal, because we think that it's a disagreement between people. So we tend to think this about the other person. We tend to think that, oh, why there's only sort of there's a short list of reasons why somebody might disagree with us. They're ignorant. They just don't know what we know. They're stupid. They're incapable of knowing what we know. So they're not smart enough. Or they could be insane. They're so out of touch with reality that they're kind of just okay, they know that what we're saying is true, but they deny it for some reason. Maybe there's some kind of personal thing they don't want to give up. Maybe they're being controlled by the devil or some kind of demonic forces, but maybe they're in league with some sort of a big conspiracy. But we tend to put people who disagree with us in one of these categories, because otherwise, how on earth do we explain the fact that they can't see exactly what we're seeing when they look at this thing that is plain as day right in front of us? Well, the reason is this, is that none of us reads something like the Bible just unfiltered. The Bible is always going to pass through some sort of interpretive principle that we have arrived at. Most of us have no idea how we arrived at this interpretive principle. A lot of us don't even understand that we're practicing it, because everything we're seeing appears to be self-evident, but it only appears to be self-evident because of the grid that we're using to interpret the world. So what informs that interpretive principle? Well, for this, I'm going to rely, I'm going to rely on somebody named John Wesley. So people came up with this idea based on his writings called the Wesleyan quadrilateral, saying that there's 4 main belief-producing mechanisms. And so, yeah, what I want to show here is that when we do come into a conflict with somebody, it can get personal, but really the disagreement, it's something to do with our interpretive principle. There's some part of it that's clashing. So that actually, now we can say that our disagreement is one step removed from the person. So we can maybe take a little bit of the emotion out of it and try and kind of become a detective to go, where are the wires getting crossed? What informs our interpretive principle? Well, you have the Bible, of course, but that's going to be filtered through this top thing here. It's my symbol for tradition. That's what the person with the necktie is, tradition. So we will come from various types of Christian traditions. There's the whole Protestant side, there's Catholic, there's Orthodox, and then there's sub-traditions within those traditions. And those are going to form an historical way of looking at a particular issue that is going to seem self-evident to us, or maybe we've converted into that faith and we've made a conscious decision to move within that tradition. I also have a picture of a brain, and so that stands for reason. There's always going to be a set of arguments and evidence that we find persuasive, or at least emotionally appealing. And then I have a picture of the globe that stands for experience. So we have the Bible, we have tradition, we have reason, and we have experience. These things work and interact in a very complicated way whenever we encounter something like the Bible. So so we're going to filter it through these different things. And so you could have a Catholic tradition, Orthodox, Anglican, other. We could have your experience, my experience. How do we compare those two? And then there's different philosophical or theological systems. So our brains are pretty amazing that we're processing all of these things simultaneously. So this is a better way of looking at, if we're going to have a disagreement, this is what's going on. It's starting to look very complicated. So it's not necessarily a person versus a person. It's this complex web that forms our interpretive principle that is actually the source of the conflict. Now, there's different ways to arrange this. Some people say that if you're going to read the Bible, you should interpret it first through experience, and then go to tradition and reason, and then form some kind of a conclusion. Other people say, it should initially pass through tradition. So if you're in a Catholic tradition in particular, you're going to really default to what the church has said historically, and then you're going to weigh that through reason and experience. And then other people might approach things from a very analytical point of view, where logic is really, going to be the primary thing, and then we'll turn to tradition and experience and weigh it within that. So we have different ways of arranging these things in terms of what's the first set of filters the Bible goes through, what's second, third, and we're going to be looping through these things as well. So we might have a disagreement about what's the first thing we should turn to. Is experience the most important thing? It doesn't matter what the tradition says, it matters what's happening right in front of us. Is tradition the most important thing? Because experience, there's the whole thing called the availability bias. Like, we tend to default to the thing that we remember that happened most recently. But that's why we don't want to depend on anecdotal information when it comes to science. We want to look at long-term studies. And so that's kind of what tradition becomes, is sort of a long-term study to really want to start in that. So we might have a disagreement about what is the first filter that things should pass through. So that leads to conflict. And there's another way to do this, is that some people say we shouldn't start with the Bible. And so this is where we kind of move. This could happen within Christianity, but it also could happen outside of Christianity. But again, a Protestant point of view is to begin with the Bible, or especially within an evangelical framework, but within a Catholic or Orthodox point of view, they would say, well, the church wrote the Bible, so then we should default to tradition first. And tradition is going to show us even what should be in the Bible, number one, but number two, how should we read what the church has decided is canonical or not. Other people might want to start with reason or experience and move that in. So again, you can see all these different levels of conflict, right? So we might have a conflict about where do we start, where do we go second, where do we go third, and where do we go from there. And so you just have thunderstorms everywhere. So I think it's helpful to think about this, that we're all very complicated individuals. We probably, a lot of us, I'm just going to up here, we probably don't know, we've never really spent a great deal of time even figuring out how our interpretive principle got formed. And is it even constructive? We cling to it because possibly it's the only one we know. We might have been warned against other ways of looking at things. We might worry that if we turn away from our particular tradition, that we're in danger of going to hell or something like that. Yeah, I'm just going to get back here. So it can become very alarming and complicated, and there's also a big social cost in terms of changing the way we look at things, and so we can become fearful about that, being ostracized and all that sort of thing. So I'm going to show you one other thing here. I'm going to do. I can't really see you guys, so I'm going to. Let's see how this works. So I'm just quickly, I had this all open, but I had to close it all to make my screen sharing work. Here we go. All right, so normally what I do, and I'm going to turn on screen sharing again.
There it is, it's good.
Okay, great. No, that's not what I want. Sorry, I just screwed up. Okay, here we go. Okay, so normally what I do is, and this is not working because anyway, is I prime, if I could see half of you, what I would do is I would prime half of you with letters. Just get you to look at this for a few seconds so you can kind of get letters in your mind. Then I would prime the other half of you with numbers. And just again, to sort of predispose your mind to looking at things a certain way. And then I would show you this. And I would ask you, what is this thing? And probably the majority of you who were primed with numbers would see it as a 13, and the other half of you would see it as a B. And so that just is kind of analogous to, we're all raised within a particular tradition and background that predisposes us to look at the world in a certain way. But there's something else, context. So if I add context, suddenly it becomes a lot easier to see this as a B. If I change the context, it becomes easier to see this as a 13. But if I do this, now it depends, your brain is going to be automatically flip-flopping depending on, are you paying attention to the letters or the numbers? So that thing in the middle is going to start flickering back and forth between a letter and a number. So we can give your brain a little break. And you can see now it's whatever it is, but it's probably harder to see it as really clearly something. And then when I do this, now it really starts to loosen up your brain because, you could start to see it as not a B or a 13, it could be a W. Who knows, I could flip it like this. For some reason, I see a rabbit hiding behind a fence when I see that, but your mind will start to go to more abstract things. I could do this, make it backwards. Now you might see an E and an I. So then I come back to this, and my question is, what is this? And answer probably, but really, what is it? It is a straight line, and it's a curved line. And you could break that even down further. It's basically pixels on a screen, who knows? But it had, my point is that image has no inherent meaning. The only meaning it has is meaning that we project onto it. So we construct our reality. And we do it even with something as simple as a straight line and a curved line. Because of the way we're primed, because of the context in which we encounter it, we fool ourselves into thinking it contains a meaning. All we have to do is discover it. But exactly the opposite is happening. It has zero meaning until we bring something to the table. So that's a good example of how we do that with just a simple symbol. So think about if we replace that with the Bible. We act, I mean, definitely the Bible's different in the sense that there are authors involved who have an intent, but we don't know those people and we can't necessarily discern their intent. The best we can do is to try and interpret their intent. So we are constantly in the role of interpreter. And of course, we're also reading the Bible one or two steps removed, because we're reading it in a completely different culture, from a different socioeconomic position, in a different language. And of course, we all know language doesn't just, there's never a one-for-one way to translate. That languages, are a way of approaching the world as well. So hopefully what that gives us is some epistemological humility. Coming back to Romans, that passage I read from Romans 12, is that we shouldn't think of ourselves more highly than we ought to. And so what we want to build into our way of approaching the Bible or approaching people who disagree with us is how do we inject some humility into our point of view? And also, how do we locate the point of contention when we're disagreeing with somebody? Because what you're going to find with every issue is people who are highly intelligent, who are people of goodwill, trying to do the best that they can to make sense according to their best lights. Of course, there's always some bad actors out there for sure, but those people are in the minority by and large. That most of us are just trying to sort this out. And so, I think it's important to kind of think through these types of issues, and to listen and to try and locate the source of disagreement, because what we're going to find is that we probably have a lot more in common with the people we disagree with. Think about the whole, I don't even like the term anti-vaxxer, because that right away makes, that's a way of positioning somebody. But people who have strong concerns about vaccines, what do they want ultimately? They want safety. They want people, they want us to have good public health policies. Well, guess what? That's exactly what people who are promoting vaccines want. So there's a huge point of commonality. So the real point of disagreement is, how do we get there? And we can have disagreements about the science regarding vaccines, but anti-vaxxers aren't crazy. And people who are trying to promote vaccines aren't these evil capitalists who are trying to, take control of the world. That's taking something that should be a scientific discussion and making it an ad hominem attack against people who disagree with you. That is the way of the world. Because people benefit from ad hominem attacks. Facebook benefits from that. Twitter benefits from that. We're in, a surveillance economy. We're in an attention economy, and you can get the most attention by making people angry. And so, how do you make people angry? Not by having a dispassionate, perhaps highly emotionally engaging scientific discussion, but by devolving everything into a very angry, bitter dispute. And so, we don't want to be we don't want to be pawns in that game. I think we can have, I get very excited about ideas and very passionate. And I think that passion is really important to drive us, to do our best thinking, but it doesn't have to be angry. And it can get angry, but again, we hopefully don't damage relationships by having these kinds of disputes. So anyway, that's my little talk for today. So I'll turn over to Cody and anyone who has any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yes, if you have any questions, go ahead and let me know in the chat room, either on Zoom or Facebook, and I'll read them to Kevin. Kevin, so man, I got excited just because you mentioned Girard there at the beginning. So that's, I'm not real in depth into Girardian thought, but I know a bit about it and want to learn more about it. So we all kind of have this, would you say, I don't know, is it inherent in human nature to scapegoat? Is it an inherent trait, or is it something that we've just learned, do you think?
Well, I think Girard would argue that it's a learned trait. So animals, in order to form hierarchy, they do it through violence. So they do it through a dominance hierarchy. So once we become self-conscious and we evolve to the point where we're beyond the consciousness of other animals, then we have to find a new way to form hierarchy. And so he would argue that scapegoating becomes a mechanism, so that
Okay.
it becomes this way of, instead of the war of all against all, because that tends to develop when we're all competing to be the one, right? We're all competing to be the one that everyone else imitates. That if we find somebody that the whole community can agree on is bad, could be somebody in the group or could be somebody outside the group, that kind of settles things out. And so he would argue that and the funny thing is, scapegoating is what enabled us to advance as a species, because it's sort of like inoculating us against violence by using a little bit of violence. He would argue it's the source of religion, it's the source of civilization, but ultimately, what the gospel is trying to do, what Jesus is trying to do, is step into that scapegoating mechanism to reveal it,
Right.
to reveal basically what is the kingdom. The kingdom is a new way of forming community, which no longer requires victims, because Jesus becomes the victim at the heart of community.
So kind of like the idea, biblically, it would be expressed as in Jesus submitted himself to our way of doing things, that the Corinthians passage, submitted himself, but in a sense, it was also a subversive upending of that system, or to show the truth, I guess, behind that system of how just wrong it is. I guess.
Right, yeah, and also to help. I mean, and again, there's a great amount of empathy. I think that, the reason Hebrews 2 says the reason why the Son of Man took on flesh and blood was to free those who all their lives have been slaves to the fear of death. So
Hmm.
so what Jesus had to do was not only step into that mechanism, but also defeat it. And so that, because it's always being driven by the fear of death, and
Yeah.
so we use death to try and conquer that fear. And so Jesus has to conquer the fear of death in order to, make it safe to not scapegoat, because we can now, we have the hope of resurrection, and so that death has been conquered. So we don't need to be involved in these self-centered works of self-preservation, which is what scapegoating ultimately amounts to.
Yep. Are there any, you're kind of talking about, okay, we're talking about these filters that everything comes through, so you use the example of the Bible, but really any knowledge comes to us filtered through a lens or an interpretive approach that we take and we're so in that, right? Like, what's that old saying? Like, fish in water don't know what water is, right? Because they're just so in depth in it. Is there any exercises you would recommend for us that would help us see the water that we're swimming in? In other words, the interpretive lens, like, because for some of us, it's so ingrained in us, we don't even know it's there. We don't even recognize it.
Right. No, I think that's a great question. And I think it's to just take a particular belief and something that's really important to you and try and figure out where it came from, because we all sort of inherit. So something, I've looked at a lot is hell. So what do you believe about hell, and how did you get there? Was that something that you learned in Sunday school? Was it something that came through your church? Was it from a book you read? Is it from a community that you're part of? But just try and track down the source of that belief, and look at the sources that provided it to you, and then try and look at other ways of looking at it. Something like hell. There's some great books out there that will look at different views on hell, and will show how people people who believe in annihilation, and people who believe in eternal torment, people who believe in universalism, and it will compare sort of their way of forming the belief. So I think that just being self-conscious, because and I think that would be the first thing I would say.
Yeah, I probably know the answer to this, but or what you're going to say, but is there ever any hope at all of ever having a completely unbiased view of anything?
No.
Okay.
And, I wouldn't think so. I mean, it's funny. I've thought about this even with God. Like, we say God's omniscient, but then God, and again, I think this is why Jesus took on flesh and blood. Like, you could even say, well, God's got the ultimate, but then you could only say, well, God only knows what it's like to look at the world from an omniscient point of view. Mars is doing, he's becoming fully human. Maybe that's God adding the piece of the puzzle that's missing. But no, I don't think we can, because that would be, I think that the best we can ever hope for, and this is where I think science teaches us a lot, is that what we're doing in our brain is we're forming models of the world, and And so I think that, you could sort of say that we're getting increasingly accurate models of the world, but I'm not even sure if that's true, because in a sense, our models create the world that we see.
Right.
So the alarming thing, but also the exciting thing, is the deeper you go down the rabbit hole in terms of the whole study of epistemology, which is how do we know that or how do you differentiate basically belief from mere opinion? It becomes very complex, in terms of the interplay. So.
Okay, I'm going to unmute Matthew, and he's going to ask you his question.
Yeah, it seems like there's some overlap here between what you call interpretive principles and the study of cognitive fallacies. Would you say that's correct?
Definitely. I mean, and so how do they interplay? I mean, I think that number one, being aware of your interpretive principle can help guard you against cognitive fallacies. But you might find out that your whole principle is based on a cognitive fallacy. And it's funny. I've been going through. There's a website that basically it lists like 20 different cognitive biases, and so I've been kind of starting to post them one by one on my Facebook page, because I think it's important that because if you're not even aware of what these things are, you could just be falling victim to them over and over again. So yeah, I think it's a great point to raise.
I have a question about, I don't know how to term it. Some people, it kind of has this idea of like what some people might reference as purity culture, meaning like you just purely ideologically always are within this specific way of thinking, and you're always right about it, and and then when a mistake or a thought pattern or even behavior pattern shows up maybe from the past that hopefully you've learned from and grown from, but people have a tendency, then we need to discredit or everything that this person has ever said. So the prime example that I think of is a guy named John Howard Yoder. I'm sure you've probably heard of him before. And
yeah.
His teaching is good. It's solid stuff, but he clearly in his life did not live it out. And so some people discount everything he says because of he didn't live up to the principles. Do you have anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have looked at that even in the whole Me Too thing. I heard somebody talking the other day about his daughter had discovered the Cosby Show, and she's 12 years old. She has no knowledge of Bill Cosby's nefarious acts, and he's like, should I let her continue to enjoy that show in ignorance or not? And so, yeah, can a person's work stand separate from the person who created the work? And I think that's something that everyone has to decide on their own. And I think it's easier to make that decision with something that's sort of a hard science. Like if we found out that Einstein was a pedophile, do we throw out general relativity and special relativity? Well, clearly not, because what he discovered it's really totally disassociated from the person. It gets more difficult when somebody's teaching something that should have a direct bearing on their personal life. But even somebody like John Howard Yoder, if he's teaching principles that are true, independent of the man, then I don't see any problem with people running with that type of thing. It would be kind of foolish to do that. And I think that we're unfortunately in that canceling mode. And I think it would be a mistake for sure to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak.
Okay, yeah. Let me check Facebook Live and see if there's any questions here from anybody. I'm not seeing anything there. All right, in the Zoom chat, anybody have any more they want to ask? Okay, I'm not seeing anything there. All right, Kevin. Buddy, I really appreciate it. By the way, everybody, I didn't say this. I told Kevin I might in the intro. Kevin has 1 credit. If you go to IMDb, because of his film work, he has a page there, but he has an acting credit. I'm sure you have more than one, but the one that really jumped out to me is, does Kevin look familiar to any Smallville hardcore? You have to be really hardcore Smallville fan, because I think you were only 1 episode. Is that right, or was it 2?
I might have been in 2, to be honest. I never checked, but I know I was in 1 for sure. Yeah.
Kevin played Lex Luthor in Smallville for at least 1 episode.
Yeah, it was a fun episode too, because I was trying to kill Superman with a bomb and I got blown up, and so it was pretty cool.
Awesome. All right, Kevin. Hey, we appreciate you being here so much. Can you tell people a little bit how they can connect with your work and something you're working on right now too?
Yeah, for sure. So I released a film just about a month ago called JES USA. You can check it out at jesusafilm.com. It's currently only available on Vimeo on demand. Just we've been hit by the pandemic, so our distributor's been backlogged. Eventually, we'll be on iTunes, Google Play, Amazon, and then you can also check out my my novels and that sort of thing on kevinmillerxi.com. And yeah, so yeah, check those out. jesusafilm.com and kevinmillerxi.com.
Awesome. Yep. Kevin has a series of children's books called the Milligan Creek series, and then also some comic books that he's worked on too. So go check those out. I know you'll love them. And I'm excited. I would like to, for our churches to host a film screening one day of JES USA. So look for that, folks, from Clarkston and Lewiston someday soon. All right. Kevin, appreciate it. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.